right. Well, thank you for having me. I'm going to present today over a systematic review that I conducted with um, some colleagues, Michelle Penna at Florida International University, and three of my undergraduate students here at Emporia State University. That was published, I think, earlier this year or late last year in Journal of Investigative Psychology. So if you're interested in more results, you can find it. You can find them there. But the the systematic review is over second language lie detection, so detecting lies among speakers who are speaking a second language. So to start this off, I wanted to highlight sort of the burden of the problem, which was when we started doing this project, we were interested in specifically in the United States, where we have almost 20% of the population who are non-native speakers of English, who reported on I think it was the census, some data collection that they speak English less than very well, and they speak a language other than English in their home. And I looked up and found um, from the British census, about 1 million people living in the UK, or about 1.5% of people living in the UK, report something similar. And the easy answer is, okay, get an interpreter. But that tends to not happen. So there's some research, I think, by Evans and Schaefer and colleagues that shows that police are somewhat reluctant to do that when they're talking to witnesses as well as suspects. There are some reports from places like the New York Times that show it just doesn't happen. So when an interview happens with people who speak a language other than the primary language of the area that they're in, it happens in that primary language, i.e. the person's second language, which they may or may not speak very well. So that's sort of the burden of the problem. And then I had this giant slide with the 54%, the classic number from Bond and DiPaolo. So people are already not that great at detecting lies. And a lot of these studies are done with people judging lies, statements in their native language. So add on top of this the cognitive burden of speaking a second language. So speaking a second language is cognitively demanding. There are some linguistic frameworks from people like Kroll and Curley and work in the linguistics world by Lavelt and colleagues that suggest formulating a second language, especially for novice speakers. So that part of the population that we're talking about speaks less than very well. Their process is sort of a multi-step process where a lot of novice speakers go through a sort of series of translations, which of course is extra cognitive steps. Um, to that end, there have been several studies that look at imposing cognitive load as a method of lie detection. So work by Wright and colleagues in various domains have found things like imposing a reverse order interviewing strategy increases lie detection accuracy somewhere on the order of between a half and full standard deviation, or Cohen's d. Asking interviewees to maintain eye contact, same thing, improves it somewhere on the order of almost a whole standard deviation, a whole Cohen's d. Um, so we've seen from research that adding cognitive load seems to improve lie detection accuracy. And that led us to think, well, does adding the cognitive load of speaking a second language improve observers' ability to detect lies delivered in a person's second language? So does the added cognitive load of speaking a second language amplify cues to deception? On the other hand, we also were kind of aware that maybe that doesn't amplify good cues to deception, valid cues to deception. Maybe it adds noise to the the process. And so maybe instead of increasing lie detection ability, it amplifies a response bias. And in particular, we predicted a lie bias toward people speaking a second language. And I'll note here, I don't have it on the slides, but it's worth noting here that there's a lot of background research in social psych on accent bias and things like that that show, even true statements delivered in a foreign sounding accent are rated as being less truthful compared to those delivered in an accent that's familiar to the participants in the study. So there's reason to think that a response bias would exist and would manifest in judging speakers of second languages. So we conducted a systematic review on this topic, and we focused on published studies because we wanted to focus on the things that were actually out there and available for others to access through PsycInfo or other databases. And so we ended up, this is our full Prisma diagram, but we ended up with 10 publications and 11 total studies. One of them had 2 experiments in the study. And we specifically looked for studies where participants had to make truth or lie judgments of verbal statements given by native and non-native speakers of their language. So we didn't necessarily restrict it to English speakers versus other speakers. We just looked at native versus non-native speakers of any language. We also excluded any studies that looked at interpreters, because even though that's an important line of research, that adds an additional variable that we did not want to look at with this current data set. So we got our 11 total articles or experiments from 10 articles. As far as discrimination, we predicted that discrimination accuracy would be better than chance for judging non-native speakers. We based that on the past work on cognitive load, and so we operationalized speaking a second language as being a cognitive load manipulation. And so to the extent that the other cognitive load manipulations increase discrimination accuracy, so should speaking a second language. We also calculated the effect sizes compared to chance rather than compared to the native speakers condition. Part of our motivation behind doing this was people in the real world who are making these judgments don't necessarily always have a comparison group. And so it seems to us to be informative to compare the lie detection, the discrimination accuracy to chance, rather in our specific review rather than to the native speakers condition. And so to do that, we just extracted the descriptive statistics out of the original publications. We grabbed the discrimination accuracy values, subtracted the null hypothesis predicted value for whatever measure they reported, so A sub z or D prime, and then divided it by the standard deviation reported in the original paper to get a Cohen's d comparing discrimination accuracy to chance. So again, we predicted non-native speaking interviewees our observers would be better than chance, but actually that's not what we found. We found about half of the studies found worse than chance discrimination accuracy when judging non-native speakers lie statements, truths and lie statements. About 3 were at chance level and 4 were greater than chance level. So we didn't find clear support for that hypothesis, but an interesting finding. So after we extracted that data, we started thinking about, okay, do these effects depend on the observer's native language or the observer's language proficiency? So for example, are we testing people who are in highly metropolitan areas that have experience, lots of experience with people who are non-native speakers? Are we testing people who are maybe balanced bilinguals, meaning they may speak both English and Spanish fluently? Um, and our conclusion was perhaps not, but that's sort of a tentative conclusion. There were 2 studies within our pool that specifically looked at the proficiency of the observers and compared, for example, monolingual participants to balanced bilingual participants and found no differences in their lie detection accuracy for um, non-native speakers, so perhaps not. We also wanted to know if the effects depended on the sender's native language, so the native language, or I guess I should say proficiency, the speaking proficiency of the person sending the truth or lie statement. And so on the journey to answer that question, I pulled out some of the highest effect sizes, which, well, these are the 3 highest effect sizes in the systematic review. And they also happen to be from the 2 studies that don't dichotomize native versus non-native speakers as senders. So the Elliott and Leach study, as well as the Evans et al. Paper, are the 2 studies within this set that categorize their senders as being high, medium, and low, or advanced, intermediate, and novice speakers. All of the other studies just categorize their senders as native speakers or non-native speakers. But what I think is kind of interesting about this is that the 3 highest effect sizes also represent the full gamut of proficiency levels. So the advanced speakers in Elliott and Leach's study had a pretty similar effect size to judging the low speakers in Evans et al. Studies. So does discrimination accuracy depend on how proficient the sender is? Maybe, but the data we have are currently pretty limited, and these are the highest effect sizes, and they sort of run across the board. So as far as response bias goes, we predicted that observers would show a lie bias when judging statements from non-native speakers. And we tended to find that, although it wasn't universal. There was definitely a more common tendency for observers to rate non-native senders as being deceitful compared to native senders. So there wasn't a lie bias among native speaking senders. But there definitely was a trend toward lie bias for non-native speaking senders. So those are 2 of the big takeaways from the review. So can observers tell the difference between truths and lies delivered by non-native speakers? We have mixed results across the board. As far as discrimination accuracy, about half of our studies found worse than chance accuracy, and then roughly a quarter found greater than chance, and roughly a quarter found chance. So, but again, this is limited to 11 studies that have been published so far, or as of this systematic review. That said, generally, there's a lie bias when judging non-native speakers. And so we extracted some future directions for doing these kinds of studies generally. One thing we noted was ecologically valid sampling. Most of these studies, with the exception of, I think, 1 study, were conducted with student participant observers. And I would be interested to see data for example, security or police or other legal professionals, especially given the research that shows that those people tend to be more confident in their judgments, although not necessarily more accurate. We also recommended measuring observers' proficiency, even though the 2 studies that are out there that specifically did this didn't find any predictive value of observers' proficiency. Those are two studies, and so there may be something more to find there. Particularly, there may be something that interacts with proficiency of the sender of the statement. So we also recommend varying and defining the proficiency of the sender. So rather than native versus non-native, providing some sort of proficiency level, whether that's a qualitative statement or some sort of quantitative statement, like on a language history questionnaire or a proficiency test. And then the last thing we kind of had was standardizing the reporting. So we found lots and lots of different ways that researchers reported these, from D primes to A sub Z's to some papers don't report discrimination, some papers don't report accuracy, some papers don't report truth or lie bias. And so we were kind of left wondering. Um, so standardizing which measures are reported and sort of figuring out which measures are most informative for this kind of field. And that's all I've got. So I look forward to your questions at the end of the session.